Hello again from our vicarage on a beautiful, warm, sunny afternoon. It's always so good to feel and see the sunshine, though I'm not so keen when we hit 37 degrees centigrade as we did on Friday. Some days I wake up and think that life is normal, but as soon as I look at the news, I realise that life is still a long way from normality. There are still many restrictions, though at least they are easing. I've been thinking over these past few weeks about how I might use this time of turmoil and difference to change how I live, how I think, how I make a difference. Perhaps you've been thinking too. How can we all use this strange time to help change ourselves and help change the world? My favourite saint, St. Francis of Assisi, lived in times that were certainly not normal. Born in 13th century Assisi in Italy, Francis saw wars raging on around him. The church was in disarray, so much so that the Pope of the time saw a vision of the church crumbling and little Francis holding it up. There were huge divides between rich and poor, between Christians and Muslims, and life for most people was hard and unpredictable. St. Francis, born into a wealthy family of cloth merchants, felt drawn to be a knight, a singing troubadour, a knight in shining armour on a beautiful horse. It probably sounded more romantic than reality, but that is what rich men of the day would have aspired to. But however, as much as St. Francis might have felt like being a knight was a good idea and what he should be doing, God had other ideas for him. Francis's attempt to ride into the battles just ended up with illness and imprisonment, and it was all a bit of a disaster. And I have to say that when I too have tried to live my life my own way, that too has been a bit of a disaster. Yet when this young man went in one day to pray in a humble, rather run-down little church in San Damiano, as he looked at a wooden crucifix with Jesus hanging on the cross, he heard Jesus telling him to go and rebuild my church, which as you see is falling down. Well, at first Francis started rebuilding the little humble church with new stones. But actually God was calling him to do a much greater task. He was to rebuild the Christian church, which had lost its way. So Francis diligently went round Italy showing people the gospel. He lived just as Jesus had. No home, no money, just one tunic. He gave up all his worldly possessions and became a wanderer, travelling around to show God's love to all he met. And he worked for peace in the world, particularly between Christians and Muslims. He achieved a great deal in his time. It's perhaps odd to think how these humble acts of a small, poor, little man could lead to a huge revival within the Christian church. And much to St. Francis' surprise, he also created a huge movement of Franciscans who continued to literally follow in his footsteps, as Francis had followed Jesus' footsteps. They too lived the simplest of lives and brought about huge change for good. There are many Franciscans all over the world today, still following St. Francis' rule of life, doing their best to live a gospel-shaped life in the 21st century, caring for the sick and the poor and those who find themselves vulnerable, and working for peace. I'm one of those very many. We may not live in 13th century Italy, but the times we live in are not too different. We have this terrible virus. We don't have crusades, but we do have wars and conflict. There are still tensions between religions. And the Christian church is not as alive as it should be, certainly in this country. St. Francis wasn't special. He was just an ordinary man, a failed knight. But he was humble and put his life into God's hands. And just like Mary Magdalene, who I spoke about last week, he too was made extraordinary by his devotion and obedience to God. I think perhaps we all need to use these very strange and difficult times to think about our lives. How can we, whoever we are, make a real difference in this world? How can we love more, share more, and follow in Jesus' footsteps more? May I suggest that the first step, first of all, is to let God love us more. Amen.